The morning light, filtering through the dining room's crown molding, cast strange shadows across the hardwood floor, highlighting every crack and water stain that had appeared over the past 8 months. Vivian Chase stood motionless in the doorway, her silk blouse wrinkled from another sleepless night, watching dust motes dance in the autumn air. The house felt too big now, too quiet, filled with the echo of conversations that would never happen again. "You can't keep living like this," Stella had said yesterday, her business partner's voice carrying that mix of concern and exasperation that had become so familiar. "The ceiling is literally falling apart, Viv. And when was the last time you actually sat in your living room instead of just walking through it like a ghost?" Vivian touched the wedding ring she still wore, twisting it around her finger. David would have already fixed everything by now. He'd always been the one with tools in his hands, humming off-key while he installed shelves or repaired loose floorboards. She'd been the one with spreadsheets and strategic plans, building their consulting firm from nothing into something that mattered. Now the business was thriving, but the house they'd shared was crumbling around her like everything else she'd tried to hold together. The business card sat on her kitchen counter where she'd left it 3 days ago. Rhodes Construction. Garrett Rhodes, licensed contractor. Stella had gotten the recommendation from her neighbor, promising that this Garrett person was reliable and wouldn't try to oversell her on unnecessary work. Vivian had called twice and hung up before the phone could ring. She wasn't ready for strangers in David's space, touching things he'd touched, changing things he'd chosen. But this morning, staring at the growing stain on the ceiling where last week's rain had found its way through loose shingles, she finally dialed the number. Rhodes Construction. The voice was deeper than she'd expected, with a slight rasp that suggested too much coffee and not enough sleep. "I need some work done on my house," Vivian said, her CEO voice automatically taking over. "Ceiling repairs, some general maintenance. Can you come take a look?" "Sure thing. What's the address?" She gave him the details, arranged for him to come at 2 o'clock, and spent the rest of the morning moving through her morning routine like she was preparing for a board meeting instead of letting a contractor into her home. She pulled her blonde hair back into a neat chignon, applied makeup to hide the shadows under her eyes, and chose a navy dress that said professional but not intimidating. At exactly 2 o'clock, a dark green pickup truck pulled into her circular driveway. Vivian watched from the living room window as a man climbed out, stretching his back in a way that suggested he'd been working since dawn. He was taller than she'd expected, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the October chill. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, taking a moment to look up at her Victorian home's elaborate gingerbread trim before walking to the front door. His knock was firm but not aggressive. When Vivian opened the door, she found herself looking into brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her carefully composed appearance, the dust sheets covering furniture behind her, the boxes still stacked in the hallway 8 months after the funeral. Mrs. Chase, Garrett Rhodes. He offered his hand, and she noticed calluses across his palm, paint under his fingernails. Real work hands, not the soft handshakes of executives and consultants she was used to. "You said something about ceiling problems?" "Yes, please come in." She stepped aside, hyper-aware of how her heels clicked against the hardwood as she led him toward the dining room. "It started as a small stain, but it's been getting worse. I think there might be a leak in the roof." Garrett tilted his head back, studying the water damage with a practiced eye. He pulled out a small flashlight, directing the beam across the molding, and Vivian found herself watching the concentration on his face. David used to get that same focused expression when he was working on a problem. "When did you first notice it?" Garrett asked, pulling out a notebook that had seen better days. "About 3 months ago, maybe 4. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling exposed under his professional assessment. I kept meaning to call someone, but life gets busy, he said simply, not making her finish the sentence. Looks like you've got a few loose shingles up there. Nothing too serious, but it'll get worse if we don't address it soon. Mind if I take a look at the rest of the house? Sometimes these old Victorians have issues that connect to each other. She nodded, following him through rooms that felt different, with someone else moving through them. Garrett made notes as they walked, pointing out loose floorboards, a window that wasn't quite square, kitchen cabinets that had seen better decades. But he didn't make her feel like the house was falling apart. Instead, he talked about the craftsmanship, the solid bones of the structure, the way builders in the 1890s knew how to make things that would last. They were in David's study when it happened. Vivian had been carrying the silver-framed photo of their wedding day, intending to dust the bookshelf, when the frame slipped from her hands. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, glass scattering across the Persian rug in bright, jagged pieces. For a moment she just stared at the broken glass, at David's face smiling up at her from behind a spiderweb of cracks. Then something inside her chest cracked too, and she was crying, really crying, for the first time since the funeral. Not the composed tears she'd shed at the memorial service or the quiet weeping she'd done alone in their bedroom, but the raw, ugly sobbing of someone who had been holding her breath for 8 months. She expected Garrett to make excuses and leave, the way people did when grief made them uncomfortable. Instead, he quietly found a dustpan in the kitchen and knelt beside her on the study floor, carefully picking up pieces of glass while she cried. He didn't try to comfort her with empty words or tell her everything would be okay. He just cleaned up the mess while she fell apart, and somehow that felt like the kindest thing anyone had done for her in months. When the worst of it passed, Vivian wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving dark smudges of mascara on her skin. "I'm sorry, I don't usually. It's been a difficult year." "No need to apologize," Garrett said, dumping the last of the glass into the dustpan. "Grief doesn't follow anybody's schedule." Something in the way he said it made her look at him more carefully. There was understanding in his eyes, the kind that came from experience rather than sympathy. "The photo can be reframed," he said gently, holding up the undamaged picture. "Glass breaks, but the memories don't." She nodded, not trusting her voice. They finished the walkthrough in comfortable silence, and when Garrett sat at her kitchen table to write up an estimate, Vivian made coffee out of habit more than politeness. "The roof work will take about a week," he said, sliding the paper across to her. "The other stuff, flooring, cabinet repairs, some general maintenance, probably another 3 weeks if we take it slow. I can work around your schedule, do the noisy stuff when you're at the office." Vivian looked at the estimate and blinked. "This seems low," Garrett shrugged, suddenly finding his coffee very interesting. "Old houses deserve to be taken care of properly, and..." He paused, then met her eyes. "I lost someone too. Few years back. I know what it's like when everything familiar starts breaking down around you." She felt tears threaten again, but this time they felt different. Not the sharp pain of loss, but something softer, relief maybe at being understood without having to explain. "When can you start?" she asked. "Monday morning, if that works for you." As Garrett packed up his notebook and measuring tape, Vivian walked him to the front door. He paused on the threshold, looking back at the boxes still stacked in the hallway. "Mrs. Chase, take your time with all this. Houses are patient. They'll wait until you're ready." After his truck disappeared down the street, Vivian stood in her foyer for a long time, listening to the house settle around her. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. By Tuesday morning, Mrs. Pemberton from next door was already asking questions. Vivian was retrieving her mail when her neighbor appeared at the property line, pruning shears in hand, and curiosity written across her face. "That's a lovely truck your contractor has," Mrs. Pemberton said, her tone suggesting the truck was anything. "But lovely. He certainly keeps regular hours." "The work requires consistency," Vivian replied evenly. though she felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd started bringing Garrett coffee around 10 each morning, telling herself it was simple politeness. The fact that she'd begun brewing the expensive Ethiopian blend David had loved, or that she'd found herself looking forward to their brief conversations, was irrelevant. "Of course, dear. Though I do hope you're being careful. A woman in your position, alone in such a large house. Well, one can't be too cautious about who we let into our private spaces." Vivian's fingers tightened around the mail. "Garrett comes highly recommended." "I'm sure he does." Mrs. Pemberton's smile was sharp as her pruning shears. "I'm simply saying that people talk, and after poor David, well, appearances matter." The conversation left Vivian unsettled, though she couldn't quite name why. That afternoon, she found herself working from her home office instead of going to the consulting firm, telling herself she needed to supervise the roof repairs. But really, she'd begun to enjoy the sounds of work happening around her. The rhythmic hammering, Garrett's occasional off-key whistling, the sense that her house was being cared for again. She was reviewing quarterly reports when she heard him swear softly from the dining room. Looking up from her laptop, she saw him standing on a ladder, examining something in the crown molding with a frown. "Problem?" she asked from the doorway. "Might be." Garrett climbed down, wiping his hands on a rag. "Looks like there's more water damage than I initially thought. Some of this molding is going to need to be replaced, and I want to check the structural integrity of the ceiling joists. How much longer will that take? Another week, maybe 2, if we find more issues." He studied her face. "Is that a problem? I know you probably want to get back to normal." "Normal?" Vivian almost laughed. She'd forgotten what normal felt like. But these past few days, with Garrett moving quietly through her house, fixing things that had been broken, somehow felt closer to normal than anything had in months. "It's fine," she said. "Take whatever time you need." That evening, her mother-in-law called during dinner. Patricia Chase had never been warm, but since David's death her calls had taken on a distinctly possessive quality. "I drove by the house today," Patricia said without preamble. "There's been a truck in your driveway every day this week. I'm having some repairs done." "What kind of repairs?" David always took care of the house himself. Vivian set down her fork, her appetite disappearing. The roof was leaking. The ceiling needed work. "You should have called Thomas." Patricia's eldest son was a lawyer who considered himself handy with tools, despite evidence to the contrary. Family should take care of family. "I hired a professional contractor." A stranger. Patricia's disapproval traveled clearly across the phone line. "Vivian, I know you're still adjusting, but you need to think about how things appear. David's memory deserves better than neighborhood gossip." David's memory isn't threatened by home repairs, isn't it? A widow, alone with some handyman day after day. People notice these things, Vivian. They talk. After Patricia hung up, Vivian sat in her kitchen staring at her half-eaten dinner. She thought about Mrs. Pemberton's pointed comments, about the way 2 women at the grocery store had stopped talking when she'd walked past their aisle yesterday. Was she really doing something wrong by having her house repaired, by enjoying brief conversations with a man who understood loss? The next morning, she was distant when Garrett arrived. Professional, polite. She offered coffee but didn't linger to drink it with him. She worked in her office with the door closed, emerging only when absolutely necessary. Garrett noticed immediately. He'd been looking forward to their morning talks more than he cared to admit, had found himself working more carefully on details he could have rushed through, extending conversations that should have been purely functional. But today, Vivian seemed to have retreated behind the same composed mask she'd worn when he first met her. By Thursday, the change in dynamic was unmistakable. Vivian answered his questions with yes or no responses, avoided eye contact, disappeared. Into her office, whenever he entered a room, Garrett told himself it didn't matter. He was there to do a job, not make friends. But something about her sudden coldness bothered him more than it should have. Friday afternoon, he was packing up his tools when he overheard her on a phone call in the kitchen. Her voice carried through the thin walls of the old house, sharp, with frustration. "Yes, Stella, I understand the Martinez account is important, but I can't leave right now. No, it's not about the house. Yes, the contractor is still here. No, that's not—" Vivian's voice dropped to a whisper, but Garrett could still make out the words. "People are talking. Patricia thinks— I know it sounds ridiculous, but maybe I should have him finish quickly." And Garrett closed his toolbox harder than necessary, so that was it. He'd seen this before in other jobs. Wealthy clients who got nervous about having working-class men in their homes too long, worried about what the neighbors might think. He'd thought Vivian was different, but maybe grief made people do strange things. He was loading his truck when Vivian appeared on the front steps, her arms wrapped around herself against the October wind. "Garrett, I wanted to talk to you about the timeline." He turned, his expression carefully neutral. "Sure, what do you need?" "How much longer do you think the work will take? I know you mentioned another week or two, but if there's a way to expedite things, you want me gone faster." It wasn't a question. Vivian's cheeks flushed. "It's not that, it's just complicated." "Yeah, I bet it is." Garrett slammed the tailgate of his truck, the sound sharp in the quiet street. "Don't worry, Mrs. Chase. I'll make sure to wrap up as quickly as possible. Wouldn't want to damage your reputation." He drove away before she could respond, leaving Vivian standing on her front steps feeling like she'd just made a terrible mistake. That weekend, Garrett almost didn't come back. He sat in his small apartment above the hardware store downtown, staring at his notes about the Chase house repairs, and telling himself he should just finish the job quickly and professionally. No more lingering conversations, no more noticing how Vivian's eyes lit up when she talked about her consulting work, or how she unconsciously touched her wedding ring when she mentioned her late husband. But Sunday evening, conscience got the better of him. He'd promised to check the structural integrity of the ceiling joists, and if there were real problems, Vivian needed to know. Her feelings about his presence were irrelevant. Professional responsibility came first. Monday morning, he arrived at the usual time to find Vivian's car already gone from the driveway. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter, crisp, professional, asking him to lock up when he finished and leave the bill. No signature, no personal touch, just business. Garrett crumpled the note and threw it away, then spent the morning examining the ceiling structure. What he found made him forget all about his wounded pride. Behind the decorative, molding water damage had compromised one of the main support beams. Not catastrophically, but enough that it needed immediate attention. Worse, the damage pattern suggested it had been happening for a while, long before the recent roof leak. This was the kind of problem that could turn dangerous if ignored. He was taking photos of the damage when something white caught his eye, wedged behind the old radiator in the corner. Garrett knelt down, working his fingers into the narrow space, until he could pull out what looked like an envelope, yellowed with age and slightly damp from the persistent moisture. The envelope was addressed to "My beloved Vivian," in handwriting he didn't recognize. The paper felt expensive, substantial. Garrett turned it over in his hands, conscience warring with curiosity. It wasn't his business, but something about finding it in the wall made it feel less like prying and more like discovering something that was meant to be found. The letter inside was dated 6 months before David Chase's death. "My darling Vivian, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're finally renovating this old house, like we always talked about. I hope that's what's happening anyway. I hope you're not sitting in our dusty rooms, afraid to change anything because you think it dishonors my memory. I've been thinking about mortality a lot lately, not in a morbid way, just practically. My father's heart attack last month reminded me that none of us knows how much time we have, and if something happens to me, I need you to know some things. First, I want you to renovate everything. Tear down walls, paint over my terrible color choices in the study, get rid of that hideous lamp I insisted on keeping in the living room. Make the house yours, the way it should have been from the beginning. Second, I need you to promise me you won't lock yourself away in grief. I know you, my love. I know how you retreat when you're hurt, how you build walls to protect yourself. But a life lived in fear of loss isn't a life worth living. I want you to love again. I want you to find someone who sees how extraordinary you are, someone who challenges you and supports you and makes you laugh the way you used to. I want you to have adventures and take risks and fill this house with new memories. You might think loving someone else diminishes what we had, but that's not how love works. Love builds upon love. Every joy you find, every moment of happiness, every new beginning, none of it takes away from us. It honors us. Be brave, my darling girl. Choose life. Choose hope. Choose love. Forever yours, David P.S. I've been secretly planning to surprise you with renovations for our anniversary. There's $30,000 in our savings account earmarked for the project. Password is your maiden name plus our wedding year. Make this house everything you've dreamed it could be. Garrett read the letter twice, his throat tight with emotion. He thought about Vivian's tears in the study, her careful distance, the way she touched her wedding ring like a talisman. Then he thought about the structural damage in her ceiling, the repairs that would cost more than she probably expected, and the savings account her husband had left specifically for this purpose. When Vivian came home that evening, she found Garrett's truck still in her driveway. She'd spent the day trying to focus on client meetings, but her mind kept drifting to their conversation on Friday. She'd replayed his expression when she'd asked him to expedite the work, the way his face had closed off, become professionally blank. She'd hurt him, she realized, and she wasn't entirely sure why that bothered her so much. She found him in the dining room, sitting at the table with papers spread in front of him. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. "About the house?" Vivian set down her purse, preparing herself for bad news about costs or complications. "How bad is it?" "It's more extensive than I thought. But it's not insurmountable." Garrett gestured to the photos he'd printed. "The water damage affected some of the structural elements. It's going to require more work, probably another month of repairs." "A month?" Vivian sank into the chair across from him. "Garrett, I can't. People are already talking. My mother-in-law thinks—" "I found something today," Garrett interrupted, sliding the letter across the table. "It was stuck behind the radiator. I think you should read it." Vivian's hands trembled as she unfolded the familiar stationery. David had always written on cream-colored paper with his fountain pen, claiming that important thoughts deserved substantial materials. She read in silence, tears streaming down her face, while Garrett sat quietly across from her. When she finished, she looked up to find him watching her with gentle understanding. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew exactly what I'd do." "Sounds like he knew you pretty well." "I've been so afraid," Vivian admitted, her voice breaking, "afraid that enjoying anything, connecting with anyone, would somehow betray what we had. But he's right. I've been dishonoring his memory by refusing to live." "For what it's worth," Garrett said carefully, "I don't think he'd want you to renovate this place alone. It's too big a job, and frankly, you need someone who knows what they're doing." Vivian laughed through her tears. "Is that your professional opinion?" "That's my professional opinion." He smiled, and she realized how much she'd missed that expression over the past few days. "I also think he'd want you to stop caring so much about what the neighbors think. Mrs. Pemberton is never going to approve. Mrs. Pemberton doesn't have to live in your house or your life." They spent the next 2 hours going through David's renovation plans, which Garrett had found tucked inside a cookbook in the kitchen. Her husband had been ambitious, knocking out a wall between the kitchen and dining room, updating the master bathroom, converting the unused servants' quarters into a home office. The scope of work would require permits, subcontractors, months of disruption. "It's too much," Vivian said finally. "I can't live in a construction zone for half a year." "You don't have to do it all at once," Garrett replied. "We could phase it, do the essential repairs first, then tackle the renovations room by room. You could stay in the guest suite while we work on the master bedroom, use the powder room while we update the main bathroom. You'd be here constantly." "Pretty much." He met her eyes. "Is that a problem?" Vivian thought about Patricia's disapproval, about Mrs. Pemberton's pointed comments, about the whispers she imagined in the grocery store. Then she thought about David's letter, about his plea for her to choose life over fear. "No," she said firmly, "it's not a problem." Over the following weeks, Vivian's house transformed from a shrine to the past into something alive and full of possibility. Garrett worked with careful precision, explaining each step of the process, asking for her input on decisions both large and small. They developed a rhythm: coffee at 10, lunch breaks where they sat on the front porch discussing paint colors and tile choices, evening conversations that stretched longer than necessary as they reviewed the day's progress. Vivian found herself looking forward to these moments more than she cared to admit. Garrett had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, a way of listening that made her feel heard rather than merely tolerated. When she talked about her consulting work, he asked intelligent questions. When she mentioned David, he didn't change the subject or offer platitudes. He simply listened, understanding that grief and joy could coexist in the same conversation. "You're different than I expected," Vivian told him one afternoon as they examined samples of hardwood flooring. "Different how?" "More thoughtful." "Most contractors I've worked with just want to get in, do the job and get paid." Garrett ran his hand along a piece of oak, testing its smoothness. "This house deserves better than that, and so do you." The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to address directly. But something was shifting, had been shifting for weeks now. The way Garrett's fingers brushed hers when he handed her coffee, the way Vivian lingered in doorways, watching him work, the comfortable silences that stretched between them, full of things neither was brave enough to say. The gossip, meanwhile, had intensified. Mrs. Pemberton made increasingly pointed comments about appropriate behavior for widows. Two women at Vivian's book club had started conversations that died when she entered the room. Worst of all, Patricia had begun calling daily, her concern growing more aggressive with each conversation. "I heard from Margaret Pemberton that this contractor situation is getting out of hand," Patricia said during one particularly unpleasant phone call. 6 weeks, Vivian? What kind of repairs take 6 weeks? "Extensive ones," Vivian replied, watching. Garrett threw the kitchen window as he examined the exterior trim. The house needed more work than anyone realized. "That's convenient and expensive, I'm sure." "David left money specifically for renovations. Did he leave money for you to develop inappropriate attachments to workmen?" The accusation hit like a slap. "That's enough, Patricia, is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're using home repairs as an excuse to play house with some stranger. David's been gone less than a year, Vivian. Have you no respect for his memory?" "Don't talk to me about respecting David's memory." Vivian's voice was dangerously quiet. "You have no idea what David wanted for me. I know he wouldn't want his wife making a fool of herself over the hired help." Vivian hung up, her hands shaking with anger and hurt. She stood at the kitchen sink for a long time, David's letter burning in her mind. Choose life, he'd written. Choose hope. But what if choosing meant disappointing everyone who claimed to care about David's memory? That evening, she was quieter than usual during her conversation with Garrett. He noticed immediately the way he'd learned to notice her moods over the past weeks. "Everything okay?" he asked as they reviewed plans for the master bathroom renovation. "Just tired," she lied. But Garrett had learned to read her too well. "What did your mother-in-law say this time?" Vivian looked up, surprised. "How did you know?" "You get this look after her calls, like you're bracing for a fight. She thinks—" Vivian paused, unsure how to explain without making things awkward between them. "She thinks I'm spending too much time with you, that people are talking." "People are always talking," Garrett said mildly. "Question is whether you care more about their opinions or your own happiness." "It's not that simple, isn't it?" He set down the bathroom plans and looked at her directly. "Vivian, what do you want? Not what your mother-in-law wants, not what the neighbors think is appropriate. What do you want?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Vivian felt her heart racing, aware they were approaching territory they'd been carefully avoiding for weeks. "I want," she started, then stopped. "I want to finish renovating this house. I want to honor David's vision while making it my own. I want to stop feeling guilty for enjoying conversations with someone who understands loss." "And after the renovations are done?" "I don't know," she whispered, but even as she said it, she realized that wasn't entirely true. She did know, had known for weeks now. She just wasn't brave enough to say it yet. The crisis came, as crises often do, from an unexpected direction. Vivian was at her office, trying to focus on a client presentation, when Stella knocked on her door with an expression that suggested trouble. "Your mother-in-law is here," Stella said, "and she brought a lawyer." Patricia swept into Vivian's office like a storm front, followed by a thin man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to discuss your recent behavior," Patricia announced, settling into the chair across from Vivian's desk without being invited. "Specifically your relationship with this contractor." "My relationship with Garrett is professional." "Is it? Because Thomas has been doing some research." Patricia nodded toward the lawyer. "It seems your Mr. Rhodes has quite an interesting past." Thomas opened his briefcase with theatrical precision, withdrawing a folder of papers. "Garrett Rhodes, age 38, previous business partnership dissolved under contentious circumstances. Former fiancée died in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving him as the sole beneficiary of her life insurance policy." "What's your point?" Vivian asked, though she felt something cold settling in her stomach. "The point," Patricia said, "is that you're being targeted by a man who has experience profiting from the deaths of women he claims to love. And I won't stand by and watch David's widow become his next victim." "That's ridiculous, is it? How much have you paid him so far? How much more has he convinced you to spend on these endless renovations? I'm sure he's been very sympathetic about your loss, very understanding of your grief." Vivian felt the foundation of her world shifting, the way it had the day David collapsed in their kitchen. Could she have been so wrong about Garrett? Had grief and loneliness made her vulnerable to manipulation? "I want him out of the house," Patricia continued. "Today. And if you don't have the strength to protect yourself, I'll do it for you." "You can't make that decision for me." "Actually, I can." Thomas slid another document across the desk. "David's will includes a morality clause. If his widow engages in behavior that brings dishonor to the family name, control of his estate, including the house, can be transferred to his mother." Vivian stared at the papers, her vision blurring with tears and rage. David would never have agreed to something like this. "David never imagined you'd need this kind of protection," Patricia said coldly. "But he loved you enough to ensure you couldn't destroy yourself completely." The drive home from the office felt like a funeral procession. Vivian's hands shook on the steering wheel as Patricia's accusations echoed in her mind. How well did she really know Garrett? Was it possible that his kindness, his understanding, his gentle presence in her grief-stricken world had all been calculated manipulation? She found him in the master bathroom, carefully installing new tile around the bathtub. He looked up when she entered, his smile fading immediately when he saw her expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting down his tools. "I need you to leave," Vivian said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. "Pack up your tools and go." Garrett stood slowly, his eyes searching her face. "What happened?" "It doesn't matter what happened. I want you gone." "Vivian, talk to me. What's going on?" "What's going on is that I made a mistake." She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces together. "I let grief make me vulnerable, and I let you take advantage of that vulnerability." The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. He took a step back, his expression shifting, from concern to hurt to something harder. "Take advantage," he repeated quietly. "Is that what you think I've been doing?" "I don't know what to think anymore." Vivian's voice broke, despite her efforts to stay controlled. "I don't know what's real and what's manipulation. I don't know if you actually care about me or if I'm just another lonely widow you can profit from." "Profit from?" Garrett's voice was dangerously quiet. "Vivian, I've been charging you about half my normal rate for weeks. Maybe that's part of the con. Make me think you're doing me a favor, build trust, then find ways to extend the work indefinitely." Garrett stared at her for a long moment, then walked past her into the dining room. He began packing his tools with quick, efficient movements, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. "Garrett, please," Vivian said, following him. "Help me understand. Tell me I'm wrong." He paused in his packing, looking up at her with eyes full of hurt and disappointment. "If you can believe I'm capable of that, then you don't know me at all, and maybe I don't know you either." He finished packing in silence while Vivian stood frozen in the doorway, watching him dismantle weeks of careful work and growing connection. At the front door, he turned back one last time. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I've never lied to you about anything. Not my past, not my feelings, not my intentions. But I can't make you trust me, and I won't try to convince someone who's already made up her mind." After his truck disappeared down the street, Vivian sank onto her front steps and cried harder than she had since David's funeral. But this time, the tears weren't just for loss. They were for the terrible possibility that she'd just destroyed something real and precious because she was too afraid to believe in it. 3 weeks passed like a slow-motion nightmare. Vivian threw herself into work, accepting every project Stella offered, staying late at the office, doing anything to avoid going home to her half-renovated house. The master bathroom remained unfinished, tiles scattered around the bathtub like abandoned promises. The dining room ceiling bore the scars of Garrett's interrupted work, raw wood exposed where he'd been installing new support beams. She hired another contractor to complete the essential repairs, but the man worked with purely functional efficiency, no interest in David's vision or her own hopes for the space. He finished the structural work and left, leaving her with a house that was safe but somehow felt more broken than before. Vivian tried to convince herself she'd made the right choice. Patricia's warnings echoed in her mind during the long, sleepless nights. The gossip at the grocery store had died down once Garrett's truck stopped appearing in her driveway. Mrs. Pemberton had actually complimented her on coming to her senses during a recent encounter at the mailbox, but David's letter remained on her nightstand, and she read it every evening, his words a constant reproach to her cowardice. Choose life. Choose hope. Choose love. She'd chosen fear instead. The realization crystallized on a grey November morning as Vivian stood in her kitchen, staring at the half-installed cabinets Garrett had been working on before she'd sent him away. She'd been telling herself that protecting David's memory was worth more than her own happiness, but the truth was simpler and more devastating. She'd been terrified of risking her heart again, terrified of the possibility that love could be taken away as suddenly as it Had been before. Stella found her there an hour later, still in her pajamas, still staring at the unfinished cabinetry. "Okay, that's enough," Stella announced, marching into the kitchen with the determination of someone staging an intervention. "You've been walking around like a ghost for 3 weeks. We're going to talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about, isn't there? Because from where I'm sitting, you fired the best contractor you've ever hired because your mother-in-law scared you with some ridiculous conspiracy theory." Vivian turned to face her business partner and oldest friend. What if she was right? What if I was being naive? About what? About a man who was clearly falling in love with you while fixing your house for half his normal rate? Stella shook her head. "Viv, I've seen predators. I've seen men who take advantage of vulnerable women. Garrett Rhodes isn't one of them." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I did some research of my own after Patricia's little ambush." Stella pulled out her phone, scrolling through screens of information. Garrett's former business partner tried to cheat him out of $50,000. The partnership dissolved because Garrett refused to use substandard materials on a church renovation. His fiancée, Sarah McKinnon, died when a drunk driver ran a red light. He donated her entire life insurance payout to Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Vivian felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "What?" "He's not some con man preying on widows, Viv. He's a good man who's been through loss and came out the other side with his integrity intact. The question is whether you're brave enough to admit you made a mistake." That afternoon, Vivian drove past Rhodes Construction 3 times before finally parking across the street. The small building looked quiet, Garrett's truck nowhere in sight. Through the window, she could see a young woman at the front desk, but no sign of the man she'd spent weeks learning to care for before throwing him out of her life. She was gathering courage to go inside when her phone rang. Patricia's name appeared on the screen, and for once, Vivian answered with something approaching relief. She needed to end this, whatever the cost. "Patricia, we need to talk." "Of course, dear. I'm so glad you've come to your senses about that contractor situation. Actually, that's not what I called about." Vivian took a deep breath, watching the construction office across the street. "I want to see David's original will, the one without your morality clause." Silence stretched across the phone line. When Patricia finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "I don't know what you mean." "I mean the clause that gives you control of David's estate if I behave inappropriately. I want to see where David actually agreed to that language." "Vivian, you're upset. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months." Vivian's voice grew stronger with each word. "David would never have signed anything that gave you the right to judge my choices or control my life. He loved me too much to put that kind of burden on either of us. The will is perfectly legal. I'm sure it is. I'm also sure that clause was added after David's death, probably as a codicil that you convinced Thomas to create using your power of attorney." Vivian had spent years analyzing contracts and legal documents for her consulting clients. She knew manipulation when she saw it, even when it was wrapped in concern and family loyalty. "How dare you accuse me of... How dare you use my grief and guilt to control me?" Vivian's anger felt clean and powerful, burning away months of self-doubt. "How dare you dishonor your son's memory by trying to prevent me from living the kind of life he wanted for me?" She hung up before Patricia could respond and sat in her car, hands shaking with adrenaline and relief. For the first time since David's death, she felt like herself again. The woman who'd built a successful business from nothing, who'd never backed down from a fight when the stakes mattered. The stakes had never mattered more than they did right now. Vivian was halfway to Garrett's apartment when she ran into him at Murphy's hardware store. She rounded the corner into the electrical supplies aisle, and there he was, examining packages of outlet covers with the same careful attention he'd once given to every detail of her renovations. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and the expression that crossed his face, surprise, wariness. Something that might have been hope quickly suppressed made her chest tighten with regret. Vivian. He nodded politely, professionally. How are the house repairs coming? Terrible, she said honestly. The new contractor has no vision, no patience, and no understanding of what the house could be. I'm sorry to hear that. But his tone suggested he wasn't particularly surprised. They stood in awkward silence among the electrical supplies, months of growing intimacy reduced to the stilted politeness of strangers. Vivian had rehearsed this conversation during the drive over, but now that he was in front of her, all her carefully planned words seemed inadequate. Garrett, I made a mistake. He set down the outlet covers, giving her his full attention. What kind of mistake? The kind where I let other people's fears become my own. The kind where I accused a good man of terrible things because I was too scared to trust my own judgment. She took a step closer, desperate to bridge the distance between them. I know about Sarah. I know about your business partner, about the life insurance money you donated, about all of it. Patricia lied to me, and I let her lies convince me to doubt what I knew was true. Garrett's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained carefully neutral. And what did you know was true? That you're nothing like the man she described. That every moment we spent together was real. That you cared about me, about the house, about honoring David's vision while helping me create something new. Her voice broke. That I was falling in love with you, and that terrified me more than anything ever has. The admission hung between them in the fluorescent-lit aisle, surrounded by the mundane tools of home repair and improvement. Garrett studied her face, searching for something she desperately hoped he would find. Love is terrifying, he said finally, especially when you've already lost someone you couldn't imagine living without. How do you do it? How do you risk caring again? You just do. One day, one choice at a time. You decide that the possibility of joy is worth the possibility of pain. He paused, then added quietly, but it has to be your choice, Vivian. No one else can make it for you. I'm making it now. She reached for his hand, relief flooding through her when he didn't pull away. I'm choosing to believe that David was right about love building upon love. I'm choosing to trust that what I feel for you doesn't diminish what I felt for him. And what do you feel for me? She looked into his brown eyes, saw the vulnerability he was trying to hide behind careful composure, and found the courage to be completely honest. I feel like I've been holding my breath for almost a year, and when I'm with you, I can finally breathe again. I feel like the house isn't the only thing you've been helping me renovate. You've been helping me remember who I am when I'm not defined by loss. She tightened her grip on his hand. I feel like I'm falling in love with you. And for the first time since David died, that doesn't feel like a betrayal. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I've been in love with you for weeks. Probably since that first day when you cried over the broken picture. You frame and let me help clean up the pieces. He lifted their joined hands, pressing a soft kiss to her fingers. But I won't be your rebound, Vivian. I won't be the safe choice you make because you're lonely. If we do this, it has to be because you want me, not because you're afraid of being alone. I'm not afraid of being alone anymore, she said, and realized it was true. I'm afraid of spending my life without you. They finished his shopping together, a simple domestic task that felt like a declaration of intent. In the parking lot, Garrett loaded outlet covers and electrical wire into his truck, while Vivian worked up the courage for what she needed to ask next. The house renovations, she began. David's plans, the vision we started working on together. Would you consider coming back to finish what we started? As your contractor. As my partner. In all of it. Garrett closed his tailgate, then turned to face her fully. "That's a big word, partner. It's a big decision, but I think David would approve." She pulled his letter from her purse, the creases now soft from repeated folding. "He wanted me to make the house mine, to fill it with new memories. I can't think of anyone I'd rather make those memories with." "What about Patricia? The neighbors? All those people whose opinions you were so worried about? They don't get to vote on my happiness." Vivian smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Besides, Mrs. Pemberton is going to have something to complain about no matter what I do. Might as well give her something worth talking about." Garrett laughed, the sound warming something deep in Vivian's chest. "When do you want me to start?" "How about now? I'll make coffee. We can look over the plans again, figure out where we left off." "I think I remember exactly where we left off," Garrett said, and the way he looked at her made it clear he wasn't talking about bathroom tiles or kitchen cabinets. The next few months transformed both Vivian's house and her life in ways she'd never imagined possible. Working alongside Garrett felt like learning a new language, the language of shared purpose, of building something together, of trusting someone else to handle the details while she focused on the bigger picture. They knocked out the wall between the kitchen and dining room, creating the open concept space David had envisioned. They updated the master bathroom with a clawfoot tub and subway tiles that caught the morning light. They converted the servants' quarters into a home office, where Vivian could work surrounded by windows and built-in bookshelves that Garrett crafted with his own hands. But more than that, they were building a relationship based on mutual respect, shared loss, and the kind of deep compatibility that comes from truly seeing each other. Garrett understood her need to honor David's memory while creating space for new experiences. Vivian appreciated his craftsmanship, his patience, his willingness to listen to her ideas and incorporate them into designs that were uniquely theirs. Patricia tried once more to interfere, showing up unannounced on a February morning when she found Garrett and Vivian painting the guest bedroom together, both of them covered in pale yellow paint and laughing at some shared joke. "This is unseemly," Patricia announced from the doorway. "David's been gone less than a year, and you're playing house with the hired help." Vivian set down her paintbrush and turned to face her mother-in-law with calm determination. "Garrett isn't hired help. He's the man I'm going to marry." The word surprised everyone, including Garrett, who looked at her with raised eyebrows and a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Did you just propose to me?" he asked. "I think I did." Vivian felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't back down. "Is that a problem?" "Only if you don't actually mean it." "I mean it." She reached for his paint-covered hand, not caring about Patricia's scandalized expression. "I mean every word of it." Patricia left in a huff, threatening lawyers and contested wills and family disgrace, but her threats felt empty now, powerless against the certainty Vivian had found in choosing love over fear, hope over safety, life over the careful preservation of grief. The wedding took place in June, exactly 18 months after David's death. It was small and simple, just close friends. Stella as maid of honor, Garrett's brother as best man. They exchanged vows in the garden behind the renovated house, surrounded by the roses David had planted years earlier and the new herbs Vivian and Garrett had added together. Vivian wore a simple cream dress instead of traditional white, and carried a bouquet that included some of David's favorite flowers, alongside new blooms that represented her future with Garrett. During the ceremony, she spoke about love that builds upon love, about the way grief and joy can coexist, about choosing courage over comfort. "David taught me that home isn't a place," she said, looking into Garrett's eyes as she spoke the vows she'd written herself. "It's the people we choose to build our lives with. You've helped me create a new kind of home, not as a replacement for what I had, but as an addition to it. A place where the past is honored and the future is welcome." Garrett's vows were shorter, but no less meaningful. "I promise to help you renovate whatever needs fixing," he said, his voice steady and sure. "The house, the broken pieces, the dreams that need rebuilding. I promise to be your partner in all of it." As the sun set over their celebration, Vivian found herself standing in the doorway of what had once been David's study and was now a reading room filled with books from both their collections. The broken picture frame had been repaired and hung in a place of honor, David's smiling face watching over the life she was building with his blessing. Garrett came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Vivian leaned back against his chest, watching their guests mingle in the garden where she'd once stood paralyzed by grief and indecision. The house glowed with warm light from every window, filled with laughter and conversation, and the promise of new memories being made. "Only that it took me so long to be brave enough for this," she said. "We got here when we were supposed to get here," Garrett replied. "Not a moment sooner or later than we were ready." As they stood together in the doorway between past and future, surrounded by the home they'd built together from broken pieces and careful hope, Vivian understood finally what David had meant in his letter. Love didn't diminish when shared. It multiplied, creating space for both grief and joy, memory and possibility, what was lost and what was found. The light between them was warm and golden, full of promise and completely their own. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel, subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in the next story.